it was a lot of things that happened along the way that were frustrating. Obviously the situation.
Ken Shamrock's name once echoed through every corner of combat sports. He wasn't just another fighter. He was the fighter. The man they called the world's most dangerous man. From the first UFC events that shaped the foundation of modern mixed martial arts to the brutal rings of Japan, to the electrifying spectacle of WWE, Ken Shamrock was everywhere. His intensity, his raw presence, his warrior spirit made him a symbol of what fighting truly meant. But now, decades later, his name is barely mentioned. The man who helped build the sport from nothing is all but forgotten. This is the untold story of how one of the greatest pioneers in combat history went from being a global legend to living in the shadows, and how one fateful moment changed everything. Before the cameras, before the pay-per-views, before the fame, Ken Shamrock was already fighting, not for glory, but for survival. Born Kenneth Kilpatrick in Macon, Georgia, his early life was defined by instability and violence. He grew up bouncing from one broken home to another, caught between abusive households and the harsh streets. By the time he was 13, he had already been stabbed, beaten, and abandoned. But rather than crumble, he hardened. Pain became his teacher. Violence became his language. His life changed when he met Bob Shamrock, a man who ran a home for troubled boys in California. Bob didn't just give him a roof, he gave him purpose. He taught Ken structure, discipline, and self-belief. He later adopted him, giving him not just a name, but an identity. Under Bob's guidance, Ken discovered wrestling, and through it, control. For the first time in his life, he wasn't fighting against the world. He was fighting for something. From there, his rise was as fast as it was brutal. He turned professional in the late 1980s, beginning in the rough world of professional wrestling before transitioning into something far more dangerous: Japan's Pancrase organization. Long before the UFC existed, Pancrase was testing the boundaries of combat, real hybrid fighting that mixed wrestling and striking in a raw, unforgiving format. And Ken didn't just compete there. He dominated. In Japan, they called him the King of Pancrase. His matches were intense, unscripted battles of survival. His refusal to tap out, his fierce gaze, and his sheer willpower made him a hero overseas. Fans admired him not just for his power, but for his spirit. He was the embodiment of the warrior ethos, fearless, disciplined, and unbreakable. Then came 1993, the birth of the Ultimate Fighting Championship. It was an experiment, a no-rules tournament to find out which fighting style was superior. Ken entered UFC 1 as the face of pure aggression. With his sculpted physique and cold confidence, he looked like a man born for this. He easily defeated his first opponent, Patrick Smith, before facing Royce Gracie, the quiet Brazilian jiu-jitsu expert who would change everything. Their fight wasn't long, but it was historic. Gracie's ground game caught Ken off guard, forcing him to tap, a moment that would burn into his memory forever. But Ken wasn't the kind of man who backed down from defeat. That loss didn't break him, it drove him. He came back stronger, fighting Gracie again in UFC 5 in a legendary 36-minute draw that showcased the raw chaos and endurance of early MMA. Those moments defined an era when there were no weight classes, no rules, just men testing the limits of human will. Ken became the first ever superfight champion, the UFC's original title holder before weight divisions existed. Every magazine cover, every highlight reel, every fan poll called him exactly what he was: the world's most dangerous man. But fame comes at a cost. By the late 1990s, MMA was still young and broke. Fighters weren't millionaires. They were bleeding for scraps. Pay-per-view numbers were small and sponsors were scarce. So when Vince McMahon's World Wrestling Federation came knocking, Ken said yes. His jump to professional wrestling shocked purists. One day he was throwing punches in cages. The next he was performing under bright lights in front of thousands of screaming fans. But to Ken, it wasn't selling out. It was survival. WWE offered something MMA couldn't: stability, money, and mass exposure. He debuted in 1997 and instantly stood out. In a world of colorful gimmicks and scripted rivalries, Ken was something different. real. His background as a legitimate fighter gave him credibility that no one else had. The audience believed in him because they knew he could actually break anyone in that ring if he wanted to. He battled legends like The Rock, Triple H, and The Undertaker. He won the Intercontinental Championship, the King of the Ring, and even headlined major pay-per-views. But beneath the success, Ken was struggling. WWE was entertainment, not combat. It was about storylines, not survival. And deep inside, he missed the chaos of real fighting. The grind of wrestling took its toll. The endless travel, the injuries, the mental strain of living between two realities. Ken's body began to fail him, but his pride wouldn't let him quit. Then came the call, an opportunity to return to the UFC. The sport he helped create was growing fast. There were new stars, new rules, and bigger audiences. Ken wanted back in. In 2002, he stepped into the octagon again, this time against the brash young star Tito Ortiz. Tito taunted him publicly, calling him old, washed up, irrelevant. For Ken, this was personal. It was old school versus new school, heart versus hype. But the fight didn't go his way. Tito dominated, pounding Ken until the referee stopped it. Ken stood up bloodied but defiant, flipping Tito off in a final act of defiance. But deep down, he knew something had changed. He fought Tito 2 more times, lost again. Each defeat chipped away at the myth he'd built. The fans who once cheered now watched with discomfort. The hero they remembered was fading. The world's most dangerous man wasn't dangerous anymore. Still, Ken kept fighting. Against Rich Franklin, against Kazushi Sakuraba, even into his 40s and 50s. Each loss made the crowds smaller, the headlines shorter, the checks thinner. He wasn't chasing glory anymore. He was chasing meaning. But while his body broke down, the real blows came from outside the cage. Dana White, the UFC president, publicly mocked him, calling him a has-been, dismissing his impact. The organization that Ken helped build turned its back on him. He sued the UFC for using his likeness without pay, but the courts ruled against him. He lost the case, and the legal fees crushed him financially. By the late 2000s, Ken Shamrock, once the face of MMA, was broke, injured, and forgotten. The man who helped build the sport from the ground up was now struggling to make ends meet. He did seminars, small wrestling shows, autograph signings, anything to get by. He tested positive for steroids in 2008, which damaged what was left of his reputation. He said it wasn't intentional, that his body needed help to keep functioning, but the fans didn't care. The myth was shattered. The world had moved on. Younger fans didn't even know who he was. The UFC celebrated its early pioneers, but Ken's name was rarely mentioned. Royce Gracie got his spotlight, as did Chuck Liddell, Randy Couture, and others. But Ken, the man who fought in the very first UFC event, was excluded. When asked about it, Dana White didn't hesitate to call him irrelevant. That hurt more than any punch. Because while Ken's body could recover from beatings, his legacy couldn't recover from erasure. He'd been there when the UFC was raw, brutal, and dangerous. When there were no gloves, no weight limits, no rules. He fought for the sport when it was banned, when people called it barbaric. And now that same sport pretended he didn't exist. But Ken refused to disappear quietly. Even in his 50s, he was still fighting. Not for belts, but for dignity. In 2015, he stepped back into the cage to face Kimbo Slice in Bellator, 2 legends long past their primes. He lost again, but he didn't care. He was still chasing something the world had taken from him: respect. He even fought Royce Gracie one last time in 2016. The rivalry that defined early MMA ended in silence, the crowd unsure whether to cheer or mourn. A few years later, he launched his own bare-knuckle fighting promotion, Valor BK, trying to bring fighting back to its pure roots. No corporations, no politics, just warriors. But the dream didn't catch on. The world had moved on to flashier things. Still, Ken pushed forward, because beneath the broken bones and faded fame was a man who refused to stop fighting, for recognition, for peace, for meaning. Today, Ken Shamrock lives quietly. He trains, he speaks at churches, he shares his faith. He posts memories of his fights on social media. Short clips, motivational quotes. The likes are few, the comments fewer, but he keeps going. When fans meet him now, it's not the awe of the 90s, it's nostalgia.